Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be looking at MLA citation and formatting, drawn from Chapter 10, Using Research, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. This video lecture and the MLA guidelines themselves cover three major areas: paper formatting, in-text citation, and works cited page formatting and entries. We'll look at each of these three areas in turn, spending by far the most time discussing the works cited page, as it is the only part you have not yet dealt with. However, before we begin, I'd like to establish why we follow the standards in the first place, especially since getting the extensive number of small details right can seem difficult and arbitrary to many students. The answer lies in two facts. One is that it's much more difficult to create your own system in a way that will work than to simply follow a system laid down by someone else. You have to do something, since it's essential to give credit where credit is due, but it would be tough to know what to leave in or out if you had to decide for yourself, and I suspect many citations would have too little information to accomplish the goals of citation if it were left up to individuals. Even more importantly, if there's a single standard that everyone learns, information can be communicated much more succinctly. If everyone knows that the numbers following the format are page numbers, you won't need to label them. As a result, MLA uses very few labels, including them only where confusion is possible. In addition, MLA in particular is useful in several ways. One is that it is simple, depending on short in-text entries to connect to a list at the end with complete information. It also has a consistent form, and you'll see how the pieces can be plugged in rather than having to figure out what type of source it is and look up rules for that specific source, as was the case in the past. We'll look at the system in detail later in the video. MLA is also nice because it's flexible. When your source does not have a piece of information you need for your entry, one easy solution is to skip that piece and move on to the rest of the entry. Another solution might be to use traditional abbreviations to show that information is missing, such as NP for no publisher, NPAG for no page numbers, or ND for no date. I will not spend very much time discussing MLA requirements for paper formatting, since you've already been required to adhere to the system since the beginning of the semester. Again, the MLA guidelines are fairly straightforward. Some formatting requirements include aspects such as margins that are exactly 1 inch on all 4 sides, double spacing, the first line of each paragraph indented exactly ½ an inch, etc. The major requirements it imposes as far as content are the information needed in the upper left and the header with your last name and page number. The following slide will show an example of a correctly formulated MLA paper. Here's an example from a paper that I wrote in graduate school. As you can see, the guidelines are followed. On the left are the needed elements in the required order: my name, the professor's name, the class name, and the date in proper MLA format. The title is capitalized and centered, but doesn't have any other special formatting, and my last name with the page number are in the header. You can tell they're in the actual header section due to the grayed out appearance. You can tell from the ruler at the top that my indentations and alignment are correct, and I have used the 12-point Times New Roman font that is most often preferred. Next, we'll take a quick look at in-text citation, which you've been using in a limited fashion so far in the semester. In-text citation is fairly basic. Before we look at exactly how it works, I just want to review with you what the intention is. The current MLA handbook states that the goal of an in-text citation is to provide enough information to lead your reader directly to the source you used, while disrupting the flow of your argument as little as possible, and that a reader interested in your source can flip to the indicated entry in your list of works cited. A reader not interested in the source can pass over the citation without being distracted. This sets up the basic expectation. You want to put as little as needed to link it. Therefore, an in-text citation is essentially a key or code that links the piece of borrowed information to the complete citation listing at the end of the paper. You are not going to put tons of information in, or really more than just one or at most 2 things, since the complete information will be on the works cited page. This is one reason that web addresses don't go into a paper. They're long and distracting. So, how should you do an in-text citation? There is a simple basic process. First, you should copy the first part of the Works Cited entry. This is usually the author's last name, but if there is no author, then the title is the first part. Then, if the source has page numbers, you put the page number after one space, since the Works Cited entry will have the page numbers for the whole thing, but not for that particular quote or idea. Third, you put the information inside a set of parentheses to mark the end of the borrowed information. Then, you're done. It's a very straightforward process. We'll take a look more closely on the next slide. Again, I will not spend very much time discussing this topic since we've already been using it, and because it's very straightforward and simple compared to the other aspects of citation. There are a few guidelines and exceptions to keep in mind. First, at the end of any section of borrowed information, but before you make any of your own comments or observations, you mark the end of the source information with a parenthetical citation, which is just parentheses with information inside, linking back to the Works Cited page. You can see the example here. It's like a code that matches up with the first part of the corresponding Works Cited entry and gives the page number for locating that particular bit of information in that source. Therefore, it's usually the last name of the author and the page number with no comma in between. If there's no author, you should use what then becomes the first part of the Works Cited entry, the title. This also means that a web address, which is listed last, should never be used as an in-text citation. If there are two authors, list both of the last names. If there are more, list the first one and add et al., which is Latin for and other people. However, if the source doesn't have page numbers, leave it out. Never assign page numbers on your own. Also, make sure that you're placing the period for the sentence correctly. The citation is part of the cited sentence, so it should not be separated by having a period in front of it. The period for the final sentence belongs after the citation. Finally, if your source exists in lots of different formats or editions with different page numbers, you should include the chapter numbers or other section numbers so that even people with different editions can find the referenced information. Other situations are covered in detail on pages 256 to 259 in the College Composition and Reading textbook. Before we dive into all the details of Works Cited pages, I'd like to take a moment to further establish why we cite at all. There are two basic reasons to cite. First, to give credit where credit is due. People deserve to get credit both for their ideas and for their expression of those ideas. Secondly, documenting your sources through citation gives your reader the ability to both learn more, because your paper was so fascinating, as well as being able to check your accuracy. Did the source really say what you're claiming they did? The information that's given in a Works Cited listing is directly based on these two requirements. In order to give credit, the title and author are given. And, to make it easy to find the resource, you give other information such as the publisher, the title of the magazine or newspaper it was inside of, the web address, and so on. Take a cue from the Credible Hulk. Back up your opinions and arguments with facts and documented sources. There's nothing like an undeniable fact to strengthen your argument, and nothing like a string of undocumented, made-up sounding facts to weaken it. Now that you've been thoroughly convinced of the value and use of citation, and maybe even gotten a bit of a laugh, we're ready to move on and take an in-depth look at the elements and composition of your Works Cited page. First, let's establish the formatting requirements for Works Cited pages, since there are several special requirements. On the left side of the screen, you can see an example of a Works Cited page from the same paper that I earlier showed you the first page of. Since I wrote it, you can see that the header is my last name. And since the Works Cited page is part of the essay, even though it should start on its own page, the page numbering is continuous. My paper was 15 pages long, so the Works Cited page starts on page 16. The title of the page is Works Cited and is centered and capitalized, but does not have any other specific formatting, just like in the main paper. Also, just like in the main part of the paper, the page should be double-spaced and have no blank lines between paragraphs or entries. Make sure to only put works that you cite in the list of Works Cited. If you didn't use it in the paper, you should not list it on the Works Cited page. The entries should be arranged alphabetically, and if you have more than one work by the same author, replace their name the second time with 3 dashes. Also, make sure to include the hanging indent, which is basically the opposite of a normal indent. With normal indentation, the first line of the paragraph is indented, and the others are not. With a hanging indent, the first line is not indented, and the others are. This not only makes it easy to tell the entries apart, it also makes it easy to match that first part with an in-text citation, if you're trying to find a source for something specific. If you aren't sure how to do a hanging indent, type the name of your word processing program and the phrase hanging indent into Google or another search engine, or even YouTube, to find specific information for your program. Now that you have an idea about the overall formatting requirements for the Works Cited page, it's time to look at how to compose the individual entries. The new MLA format is quite different than previous versions. In the past, citations were based on the source's publication format, such as a magazine article or website. You figured out what type of source you had, and then followed the rules for that source type. The new version deals instead with common features, such as author, title, and publisher, since the number of formats a source can take has expanded exponentially in the last decade or so. Now citations are based on examining the source for relevant information rather than determining the source format and then following a template. Basically, it's much more up to you, the author, to figure out what's needed or relevant to your source. There are some core elements which most sources will share, but you can also include information beyond these elements if it's important or relevant, as we'll see at the end of this lecture. This also means that the amount and type of information that you provide in the citation will depend in part on your purpose. As the MLA handbook states, a writer whose primary purpose is to give credit for borrowed material may need to provide less information than a writer who's examining the distinguishing features of particular editions. The bottom line is that you want to make your documentation useful to your readers. Therefore, you should include important aspects while leaving out ones of little importance or relevance to your project. For example, when citing a work like a DVD, only include the names of people whose roles are relevant to your discussion. You want your citation to include enough information, but enough varies depending on your goals. For now, we'll be examining the core elements and looking at some examples to see how the citations would look in different situations. As you can see from the box on this page, which is also printed in the book and is part of the chapter tear-out, there are several core elements. The order and punctuation between these elements should always stay consistent. The core elements are author, period, title of source, period, title of the container, period, other contributors, comma, version, comma, number, comma, publisher, comma, publication date, comma, location, period. Each of these will be discussed one at a time on the following slides. The first core element for any works cited listing is the author, which is followed by a period. You can see this element bolded in the core elements box on the left. There are a few things to keep in mind when putting the author down for your citation. The first is what the author is. Obviously, usually the author will be the person who wrote your source, but it can also be the person responsible for the aspect of the work you're focusing on. So if you're looking at how translations of a work differ, the translator would be listed as the author, since they are responsible for the translation, with the original author listed as an other contributor. However, if the person listed first is not the creator of the main content of the work, follow the names with a comma and a label for their role, such as editor, translator, or performer. When listing an author, you should list the last name first for alphabetizing purposes. Separate the last and first names with a comma. Also, you should omit titles, affiliations, and degrees that come before or after the name. Only suffixes that are an essential part of the name, such as junior or the third, are included. If the source has 2 authors, the names should be included in the order they're listed in the source and separated by a comma and the word and, but only the name of the first author listed gets reversed, as demonstrated below. If there are 3 or more, then you should list the first one with the last and first names reversed, followed by a comma and et al., which means and others in Latin. Finally, you should keep in mind that a company, organization, government agency, or other group can be an author. The author isn't always a person. In the case of a non-person author, leave the name as it is. Don't reverse anything. However, if the publisher is the same organization as the author, begin the entry with the title, skipping the author, and list the organization only as the publisher. If an entry begins with a government agency as author, list the name of the government followed by a comma and the name of the agency, with the name of any organizational units the agency is a part of appearing in between. You can see several examples of this on page 266 of your textbook. More examples and guidelines for other specific situations can be found on pages 265 to 266 of the textbook. The next part of the works cited entry after the author will be the title of the particular work you're using. Some things to keep in mind are to include any subtitles after a colon and to format titles correctly. All titles you mention in the paper and/or on your works cited page should either be in quotes or italics. You should italicize titles of independent or self-contained works, such as books, newspapers, magazines, and full websites, and you should put quotation marks around the titles of works that are part of something larger, like articles, chapters, television episodes, and individual web pages. Another thing to keep in mind is that titles should be copied in full as they appear in the source, except the capitalization should be standardized. All titles should have the major words capitalized, even if it doesn't appear that way in the original publication. This means capitalizing most words except the articles a and the, or short prepositions like on or by. The first word of a title should always be capitalized, no matter what it is. Guidelines for works without titles, including online comments and tweets, and other situations like emails, can be found on page 267 of the textbook, which you should refer to as needed. If your source is part of something larger, then the next core element is the title of that larger container. For example, articles are contained inside magazines and newspapers, a chapter is contained within a book, web pages are contained by the website they're part of, and television episodes are contained by the series they're a part of. If so, this larger whole can be thought of as the container, since it contains the source. If your source is not part of a larger whole, leave out this section of the citation. It doesn't apply. The title of the container will always be in italics, since it is the larger standalone work. It should be followed by a comma, like in this example from the Contemporary Reader. Sometimes a work has more than one container. A smaller container can be nested inside of a larger one. For example, you might find the episode of a TV show, which is contained by its series, on YouTube or a streaming site such as Hulu. Another example, an article might be published in a journal or newspaper, which is then hosted on a website or database online. As more and more sources are retrieved from databases or are available in several formats, it's increasingly important to document the containers in which you found your source. The MLA Handbook states that it is usually best to account for all the containers that enclose your source, especially if they are nested. For each container, look at the core elements 3 through 9, title of container through location, to find relevant information. Then add the additional container information to the end of the entry. Put a period at the end of the information about a container. For example, the citation for an article from a journal, which was found on JSTOR, an online database of journals and books, would appear like this. The article is contained by the journal it was published in, which is contained by the JSTOR database. As another example, you can see here a citation for a TV series episode, which is contained by the series, which was watched via the online streaming site Hulu, so the episode is contained by the series, which was contained by Hulu. Most often, you have multiple containers because something is available online which was originally published in a different medium. As you can see from the examples, all you have to do is add the name of the website or database and the URL to the end of the citation. The fourth core element is other contributors. Sometimes the contributions of people other than an author listed at the start of the citation are important to your research or for identifying the work. In that case, you should give them credit by listing them in this section, preceded by a label identifying their contribution. Editors and translators should always be included in other contributors if they exist, since they play a key role that deserves credit. Common labels include adapted by, directed by, edited by, illustrated by, introduction by, narrated by, performance by, translated by, and so on. If a contributor played a role in the source but not in the entire collection, list them after the title of the source rather than after the title of the container or collection. You can see this in the example. The translator only translated the individual story, whereas the editor edited the entire anthology. If your source has been published in several versions, make sure to note the version. Books are commonly published in versions called editions, which should be abbreviated as ED, as you can see in these examples. Abbreviate the word revised for a revised edition, though other descriptors, such as expanded or updated, should be written out. Works in other mediums can come in versions too, such as unabridged or abridged versions, a director's cut, or number versions, such as version 1.3.2. You can read more about this on page 270 of your textbook. If your source is part of a numbered sequence, that is important information that also needs to be included. Books can be issued in multi-volume sets, in which case you would need to indicate the volume number. Journals are often issued with volume and issue numbers. Television shows and other media are released marked with season and episode numbers. Whatever numbering system your source has, if any, you should include the number along with a descriptive term stating the type of division. The descriptive term labels chapter, number, volume, and section should be abbreviated as illustrated. All other labels, such as issue or season, should have the term spelled out. You can see two examples of citations including numbers at the bottom of this slide. The publisher of your source is the organization primarily responsible for producing the source or making it available to the public. If there are two or more listed and they seem to have contributed equally, include all of them, separating the names with a /. However, if it seems that one of the organizations was more responsible, then just cite that one by itself. The words University Press should be abbreviated as UP in publisher names. Omit business words entirely, such as company, corporation, incorporated, and limited. Therefore, the publishing company W.W. Norton and Company is listed as W.W. Norton. If a book or other print work has a publisher which is an imprint or otherwise subordinate to a parent company, just name the publisher, not the parent company. Therefore, if a book says that it was published by Anchor Books, a division of Random House, the citation would only include the name Anchor Books as the publisher. Movies and television series usually have several different companies involved in different roles. Just include the name of the major company that had the primary overall responsibility. Websites often mention the publisher in a copyright notice at the bottom of the home page. Include the city after a comma for publishers such as museums, universities, or libraries. The blog network can be considered the publisher of blogs. There are a few cases in which the publisher does not need to be included, either because there is no publisher or because it isn't needed. You do not need to include a publisher for a periodical like a journal, magazine, or newspaper, when a work was published by its author or editor, a website whose title is essentially the same as a publisher, or for a website that merely hosts content from users and has no input, such as YouTube or WordPress, or is merely an archive, such as JSTOR or ProQuest. The next core element is the publication date. One issue with publication dates is that sources can have more than one date associated with them. A book might have been published multiple times, or an article in a text might have a notice that it was previously published in a newspaper or magazine, and many things online were previously published in another form. When a source has multiple dates, cite the one that is most meaningful or relevant to your use of the source. For instance, cite the most recent date in a book with multiple copyright years, and give the online publication date of a source that you're looking at online, even if it previously appeared in print. Write the date as you find it in your source, including or omitting the month and day as you find it. If an online source also includes the time something was posted, include that as well. When there is no date present, such as on a pamphlet or a website, you may write ND for no date, where the date belongs. The final core element is location. How and whether to include a work's location depends on the medium of publication. For instance, the location for an online source is usually a URL or web address. When giving a URL, copy the entire thing from your browser, but omit the HTTP. Try to avoid citing URLs by shortening services such as tinyURL, since the link disappears if the service does. With print sources, a page number, labeled P, or a range of page numbers, labeled PP, shows the location of the print source within its container. The location of an episode on a DVD set would be the disc number. Use your common sense to figure out if there is a location to be included. You can also refer back to the textbook, which discusses these locations and more on pages 272 and 273. While the core elements are all you need for most citations, occasionally other information may be relevant and can be included at the writer's discretion. Some optional elements are placed at the end, others are placed within the citation next to the core elements that they relate to. Refer back to pages 273 to 274 for specifics on how to include optional elements, such as the date of the original publication, the date of access, the city of publication, a descriptive term, series or volume information, information about the original publication, or information about congressional sessions. Really, you should include whatever seems useful to the reader and relevant. The new guidelines give you much more flexibility to include relevant information in unusual or unique circumstances. Finally, let's take a look at some examples. I encourage you to take a few moments and pause the video to look over these various examples of correct MLA citations to get a feel for how they should look and what is included. I've included some citations of the types I feel you're most likely to use, including a citation from a collection, such as your course reader. You can see the second and third are a citation for a journal article, and then the citation for the same article gotten from an online source. I've also included examples of an online article or web page, an article in a magazine, and a blog or online forum. There are also many more examples contained in the chapter, which you can refer back to as needed. Again, I encourage you to pause the video and look over these citation examples. Thank you for watching. I hope that this overview was helpful and illuminating and has helped you get a clearer grasp on how to format and cite your papers. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you may have about the material. I'm always happy to help.